Sunday.
Thanks, Brian. Good intro. Hey, everyone. Welcome to another Trucksafe webinar, network webinar. Appreciate you being here. I'm Brandon with Trucksafe at Childress Law. Got Brian Reynolds with me, Jared Childress. Thanks, guys, for being here. Today's webinar is all about the drug and alcohol testing. Drug and alcohol basic. We're in this series, again, 7-part series that we're in the middle of, all about improving CSA scores. So far, which ones have we hit on, guys? We started with unsafe driving, went to hours of service, vehicle maintenance, and crash. And now we're at drug and alcohol, and we've got 2 more after this, hazmat and driver fitness. So we're almost to the finish line. But yeah, thanks for everybody who has tuned in to the previous ones and who are here with us today as we go along. As always, if you have any questions or thoughts about the topic, throw them in the Q&A box or the chat, and we will get to them as you raise them. A few things before we get started into the meat of the presentation here. First up, let's see if I can pull this up without screwing things up here. There we go. First up, thanks to Hall for sponsoring this webinar series. Hall builds modern compliance, safety, and risk software for commercial fleets to manage things like driver qualification and their maintenance files. Hall's offering a special deal for webinar attendees. Head over to the link on the screen or scan that QR code, and you'll get a free CSA risk analysis just by entering your USDOT number. So thanks again to Hall for sponsoring this webinar series. Appreciate it. eRegs, if you haven't checked this out yet, we encourage you to do so. This is the software we've built or have spent the last couple of years building. This is the first ever app-based digital version of the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations, which we created to help fleets not only access an always up-to-date version of the regulations on any of their devices, but also better understand the regulations through baked-in educational videos and articles, FMCSA guidance, that type of stuff, and also gives you the ability to bookmark, highlight, take notes, and also share the regulations directly with your drivers via their mobile devices. So check that out. You can try it out for free for 14 days over at eregs.app. Hope to see you there. The other thing is that this is I don't have a slide for this, but this is a Trucksafe Network webinar. I mentioned that at the start. If you're not a network member, I'd encourage you to join that. It's free to join. This is the social network we've built for fleet safety professionals to gather together and learn from one another, ask questions, that type of stuff, and also access all of our DOT-related content that we push out, including these types of webinars, videos, articles, all centered around building out cutting-edge safety programs. And so we'd love to have you there. You can do it you can join over at trucksafenetwork.com or download the Trucksafe Network app in the App Store or the Google Play Store. Network members will also, aside from getting free access to the replay of these webinars, we're also throwing in some other helpful resources that go along with these webinar sessions. So, for example, for our hours of service session that we did last month or so, network members also have access to some other print resources that we've created pertaining to hours of service. So sample driver logs, a driver hours of service checklist, that type of stuff. So long story short, join the network. We'd love to have you there. And then lastly, I'll just mention our upcoming Fleet Compliance Bootcamp. This is our 2-day in-person conference that we do a couple times a year. Our next one's coming up in Indianapolis, September 25th and 26th. Spots are filling up quick. We're about there. Come join us. We spend 2 days digging into the nitty-gritty of DOT compliance with a relatively small group of safety professionals. We usually have around 50 to 60 or so folks in attendance, and it's a great networking opportunity, a great educational session. We're also having a reception with free drinks and food. So if for no other reason, come for the food and drinks. I guess it's not free if you're paying to come to the boot camp, but it's included with your registration. So we hope to see you there. Again, Indianapolis, September 25th and 26th. Details and registration over at trucksafebootcamp.com. All right, moving on then to today's topic, which is not drug and alcohol. It is drug and alcohol. Sorry, I'm looking at a different screen here, and it had crash indicator. But today's session is on drug and alcohol. This is a basic that doesn't get all that much attention for reasons we will get into here in a little bit, namely that it is the one of the 7 basics that has the least amount of violation data in it compared to all of the other ones. The vehicle maintenance one has the most data in it. The drug and alcohol basic has the least amount of data in it. And as we'll talk about, the FMCSA is actually considering, they've already put out a proposal to do this, to shake up the way that they score carriers in their CSA scores. And one of the proposals has to do with the drug and alcohol basic specifically. So we'll get to that. But here's kind of what we have in store for the rest of the session today. Again, as we go along, if you have any questions or thoughts, throw them in the Q&A box or the chat, and we will get to those for sure. But we're going to start off with a look at how your drug and alcohol basic is scored to begin with, what factors into your drug and alcohol score, so we can get a sense of or get our minds wrapped around what things can negatively influence your drug and alcohol score, for example. And along with that, we'll talk about the top drug and alcohol related roadside violations that we're seeing come up during roadside inspections, and then screwing up or jacking up your drug and alcohol basic. And then we'll move on, because this is a relatively small basic, relatively speaking. We're also going to talk about drug and alcohol testing more broadly. One of the things that we'll talk about early on here is when we're talking about your drug and alcohol basic, these are largely going to be things that are discovered during roadside inspections. It's not testing violations that impact your drug and alcohol basic. It's like possession of drugs or alcohol in the commercial motor vehicle, or DUIs. Those types of things are the ones that influence your drug and alcohol basic. And because, thank God, there just aren't that many, relatively speaking, of those types of violations, there's just not a whole lot to talk about in this particular basic. But there is a lot to talk about, obviously, in drug and alcohol testing more broadly. So we're going to break out of the confines of the CSA scores a little bit, and we're going to get into, towards the end of today's session, drug and alcohol testing more broadly, and some of the most common issues we see arise in that context, and also in the drug and alcohol clearing context. So that's the agenda for today. I think I'm up first. Well, first of all, I should let you guys talk. Do you have anything to add before we get started here? It's been me talking this whole time.
I think one of the, as we go through this, and to your comment about there's not a ton of information in this basic as far as the scoring goes, that makes any violation that much more impactful. So, it doesn't take a lot in the way of violations to really, really take this score to a very high level very quickly.
Yeah, if you've got a score in the drug and alcohol basic, you're in the minority, and it's probably not a great score because there's, as you said, there's just so little violation data in this basic that one inspection with a drug and alcohol violation can really screw you up. So,
and then one step farther beyond that is just about everything in this is an acute or critical when it comes to an audit. So if you've got a score in there, and that's one of the reasons they're coming in to take a look at you on an audit basis, it doesn't take very much to fail that part of an audit.
Yeah, and your introduction was great, Brandon, about the limited amount of information related to the basic scoring. But a lot of what we're going to talk about today, and a lot of what the conversation always revolves around when you're talking about drug and alcohol, really impacts, like Brian just said, the compliance reviews and audits. And then also, let's not forget about highway accident litigation, because following drug and alcohol testing protocols is really, really important. And it turns out to be really, really important in highway accident litigation. So just kind of keeping that frame of reference as we start.
Yeah, so we've got a question here. Early question. I love it. Kirk's asking, our company has 54 CDL drivers and 4 current drivers on SAP. So these are SAP, substance abuse professional. These are drivers who have had a drug or alcohol violation in the past and who are in the midst of the return to duty process to get back in the seats of the truck. This question is, when the feds come in to audit, will this negatively affect our score? Not in my experience. The fact that you are a carrier that hires drivers with past drug and alcohol violations in the DOT context specifically, in my experience, I'll let the other guys chime in, but in my experience, it doesn't cast you in a negative light in and of itself in that audit. Now, obviously, if they start digging in and looking to whether you are following the procedures you are supposed to follow, the follow-up testing, namely, that you are supposed to be administering to those drivers that are in the SAP or that have finished up the SAP part. If you're not doing that correctly, certainly that's going to be a problem in that audit. But just the fact that you hire drivers who have gone through the SAP process usually doesn't cause problems in that context. Though the main reason that a lot of fleets don't do that, don't hire drivers that have gone through an SAP process, is more on the highway accident side of things, the exposure that can create for you on that side of things. So that's kind of my experience with it. Guys, you have anything to add?
Yeah, I'll say, if you're going to be one of those motor carriers that hires drivers that complete return to duty testing and you're responsible for administering that SAP plan, just make sure that you're confident that you have the controls in place to do the testing as outlined by the SAP, because as Brandon said, the highway accident risk is huge, but also if the DOT comes in and they see drivers that are on an SAP testing plan, that's the first thing they're going to ask for is the testing plan. And then they're going to look to make sure that you as the motor carrier administered that testing plan in accordance with the SAP requirements. So it can get you into trouble, but if you do it correctly, you can bring those drivers on and they're available to you and not in a prohibited status.
Yeah, it gives you a little bit of a leg up because a lot of carriers don't like to hire those drivers because of the exposure. So it gives you access to a bigger driver pool, but it comes with some risk. So, sorry, Brian.
Yeah, I think maybe the second motor carrier, that if this driver's on a plan that's 2, 3, 4 years deep on his return to work, or the follow-up testing, I should say, if you're a second or a third carrier, not only do you have to make sure that you're doing the test correctly, but you need to make sure that it was done correctly before, or if there was a lapse, did he need to start over? So verifying that the follow-up testing has been correct before the driver came to you is also a critical part of that.
Yeah, and there's not a whole lot of guidance from FMCSA on those types of issues. I've seen it go wrong in so many different ways, in the ways you've explained, Brian. I'm now the third carrier that this driver is working for. They didn't do any of the follow-up tests that were required within the first year, for example, after they completed SAP. What does that mean for me now as the third carrier that is just taking on these responsibilities now? There's no guidance on that. Either in the regulations or from the FMCSA and in any published guidance. So it does create some ambiguity that a lot of fleets just don't like to mess with. But that's kind of it in a nutshell. Thanks for the question. All right, so moving on then. I'm going to start off by talking about the scoring methodology for the drug and alcohol BASIC. It's important, like we've said in the other sessions in this webinar series, it's important that we, as a threshold matter, understand how you are scored in these different categories, because how could you ever start to put a plan together to improve these scores if you don't know how the scores are calculated in the first place? So lucky for us, the FMCSA has a whole scoring methodology that is published online. If you Google FMCSA SMS, Safety Measurement System, scoring methodology, you'll find the PDF document that details how each of the scores and all of the 7 basics are calculated. And this is what it has to say about the drug and alcohol basic specifically. It says that the controlled substances and alcohol basic deals with the operation of commercial motor vehicles by drivers who are impaired due to alcohol, illegal drugs, and the misuse of prescription or over-the-counter medications. Again, the important point here is the one that's highlighted on the screen. The violations in this basic are not testing violations. Get that baked into your mind if you're trying to get control of this basic, that it has nothing to do with your drivers testing positive or refusing test. This is not about DOT mandated drug and alcohol test. The violations from that realm are captured in DOT audits primarily. They are not impacting your drug and alcohol basic. The things that are impacting your drug and alcohol basic are the drug and alcohol violations that are discovered by law enforcement during roadside inspections, which, as you would expect, what is it that they're going to find in a roadside inspection when it comes to drug and alcohol? The main things are going to be, is the driver in possession of an unlawful drug or of alcohol while they are driving a commercial motor vehicle, or are they impaired? Are they driving under the influence? Those are far and away the most common issues that lead to problems in the drug and alcohol basic. And those are the ones, as you would expect, that then factor into your drug and alcohol basic score. Digging a little deeper here, your drug and alcohol basic measure score. I'll talk about the difference between measure scores and percentile scores here in a second, because that's also important. Your drug and alcohol basic factors in all applicable violations. That's an important phrase for the reasons I just mentioned, over the past 24 months. So any situation where an officer has discovered a drug or alcohol violation during a roadside inspection over the last 24 months, those are the violations that are going to weigh on your drug and alcohol score. A lot of carriers don't have any violations. Again, thank God, in that category. And so you won't have a score in the drug and alcohol basic if that's you. But if you have had any drug and alcohol roadside violations over the last 24 months, then you probably got a score in the drug and alcohol basic. Your score, your measure score, so the difference between the measures and the percentile scores. This is an important concept to grasp not only in this particular basic, but all of the 7 basics. If you know anything about CSA, you know that you have essentially 2 scores in the system. You have what's first called an absolute measure score. This is just how you are performing relative to yourself from month to month. So it's just adding up all of your own individual violations in a particular category and giving you a numerical score that's based on a calculation set out in the methodology. It's not a comparison of you and other carriers. It's just how you're performing relative to yourself. So, for example, if you may have a absolute measure score in the drug and alcohol basic of 2. What does 2 mean to anybody that you're telling that to? It doesn't mean anything. That's just how you're performing relative to yourself. The more important score, often the one that people are more familiar with, is the percentile score. That is how you are performing in that basic relative to your peers. So how the percentile score is calculated is they take your individual measure score on a monthly basis and they put you on a sliding percentile scale with other carriers that are in your so-called safety event group. And how your measure score stacks up against your peer group on that particular month dictates where you fall on that percentile scale. So if you have an 80% score in the drug and alcohol basic this month, that means you are performing worse than 80% of your peers in that category that month. And that's essentially what we know as CSA scores. So when folks talk about their CSA scores, they're largely talking about their percentile score, but you need to understand that your percentile score is premised on your measure score. And that measure score, at least in the drug and alcohol basic, the measure scores are calculated a little bit differently in each of the basics. But here's how it's calculated in your drug and alcohol basic. This is the second bullet point here on the screen. Your drug and alcohol measure score equals the total time and severity weights of all of your violations in that category divided by the total time weight. So what's a time weight? As we've talked about in other sessions here, all of your violations in any of the basics with it's all of them. I was going to say with the exception of crashes, but it's all of them. They are all assigned a time weight based on how recently they occurred. So the more recent the violation, the heavier the time weight is. So it's going to weigh more heavily on your score if it occurred within the last year than it would if it's older than that. So violations that have happened, Brian, you always have to remind me here. If it's happened within the last year, it's 3 points, right?
6 months.
6 months is a 3-point time weight. Between 6 and 12 months is a 2-point. And then between 12 and 24 months, it drops down to a time weight of 1. So it's either 3, 2, or 1. All right. So you take all of your time weights for all of your violations in this category that you've had over the last 24 months, you add those up, and you add them to the severity weights for those violations. Severity weights, as its name implies, are assigned to all violations. This is in the SMS methodology. Every conceivable violation that could impact your basic scores is assigned a severity weight of between 1 and 10 currently under the current scoring methodology. As you would expect, the more serious violations, the ones that are more likely to lead to crashes, are going to be more heavily weighted. So they're going to be the 10-pointers versus things that aren't likely to cause a crash, like record-keeping things like form and manner violations on your hours of service logs. Those are going to be relatively low in their severity weight. And so the point here is that you take all of your time weights and all of your severity weights for your drug and alcohol violations over the last 24 months, you add those up, and then you divide them by your total time weight. And that will get you what your drug and alcohol measure score is for this particular month. And then again, that measure score is then put on a percentile scale, and that's how ultimately your CSA scores are calculated. I mentioned earlier this concept of safety event groups. It's important because that dictates what percentile scale you get placed on. The system, the SMS system, broadly speaking, there would be an inherent unfairness if we were to try and score carriers that have relatively few inspections against carriers that have hundreds of inspections, right? Because the data is just not going to be apples to apples in that case. So what we do is we place carriers in safety event groups in each of the basics, and what group you get placed in, those are the carriers you get compared against, and that's how they calculate your percentile score. If you can read this, it's a little hard to read. Let me switch over to just the screen here. Here are the safety event groups in the drug and alcohol basic. Here's what dictates what safety event group you happen to be in. You can see that there are 4 safety event groups in this basic, and they depend on how many inspections over the last 24 months you've had with a drug and alcohol violation. If you've had 0 violations in that category in the last 24 months, then you're not going to have a score at all in this category. If you've had 1 violation in the last 24 months, you're going to be placed in the first safety event group. And then it just goes up based on how many you've had. It caps out at 4. Those in the 4th safety event group have 4 or more drug and alcohol violations in the past 24 months. So those are the carriers that you would be compared against if you're in that category. You could see that unlike some of the other basics where you have to have, like for example, in the vehicle maintenance category, there's a data sufficiency threshold in that particular basic where I think it's 5. You have to have at least 5 inspections with maintenance violations in the last 24 months to even generate a score in that category. If you've had fewer than 5 maintenance violations in the last 24 months, you're not even going to have a score in the maintenance category. But for drug and alcohol, because there are so few of those, relatively speaking, that are discovered roadside, it only takes 1 for you to get a score in the drug and alcohol basic. So if you've had 1 in the last 24 months, you're going to have a drug and alcohol score, and that score is going to depend on how weighty the violations are that you've had relative to your peers that have had the same number of inspections with violations. So hopefully that makes sense. It gets a little complicated, obviously. If you want to read more about the scoring methodology, go check out that FMCSA SMS methodology document. It's fun reading. It's like 200 pages of scoring methodology. So, all right. What else do I have here? Let's move on then to, actually, I think I've got one more slide on scoring here. Yeah, this is important. So I hinted at early on in the introduction to this session that the FMCSA is in the midst of contemplating potential changes to its safety measurement system and how it calculates your CSA scores. In fact, I think it was early 2023, so early last year, the FMCSA published a proposed change to how it's going to calculate CSA scores going forward. They haven't moved forward with those changes, but they went ahead and set up a preview website where you can actually go in and see how your scores would look once these changes take effect. But we're just kind of waiting. We're in limbo right now, waiting for them to pull the trigger on these changes. But there are several changes. We've broken these changes down in detail on one of our past podcast episodes. If anybody's interested in looking that up, you can find it in our Trucksafe Live podcast, where we broke these down in detail. But importantly, for purposes of this webinar, one of the proposed changes is to do away with the drug and alcohol basic altogether. So once these changes take effect, you're no longer even going to have a standalone drug and alcohol basic any longer. Does that mean that all of the drug and alcohol roadside violations are going away? No. We're still going to have the potential for your drivers to get cited for drug and alcohol violations during a roadside inspection. But if they're not going to go into a standalone basic, where do they go? Well, under the proposal, those are now going to filter into your unsafe driving category. So we've got an existing unsafe driving category that takes, speeding violations and lane change violations and those types of things. That's where, going forward, once the proposed changes take effect, that's where the drug and alcohol violations will live. And so drug and alcohol roadside violations going forward will impact your unsafe driving score rather than a standalone drug and alcohol basic. The reason they're doing that is because, again, there are so few violations in this category, it just doesn't make much sense to have it as a standalone category. There are so many carriers in the country that don't have a score in this category because they haven't had these violations. So just be on the lookout for that. If you haven't checked out that preview website, I recommend you do so you can, not necessarily just for this basic, but for all of your basics, you can type in your USDOT number and see what your scores are going to look like if once those changes take effect. Again, that's the FMCSA's Safety Measurement System preview website. If you Google that, you'll find it. All right, lastly, I'm going to leave you with what are the top violations that are contributing or that could possibly contribute to your drug and alcohol basic on a given month. Here they are. The list is not long. If we were to pull this list up for the maintenance violations, for example, it would be hundreds, if not, I think it's hundreds of separate violation types that could impact your score. Here with drug and alcohol testing, there are only a dozen or fewer. This isn't all of them, but it's close to all of them. You can see here that the top drug and alcohol related violations that impact your CSA score are things that we've already kind of hit on. A lot of possession of drugs and possession of alcohol. Those are the primary culprits for driving your drug and alcohol basic. But you can see also that there are other things on here as well, namely the number one thing on this list, which is a relatively recent addition to the CSA platform, and that is using a driver who is prohibited from performing safety-sensitive functions per the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse regulations. Now, we'll get into the Clearinghouse more specifically a little bit later. Jared's going to talk a lot about that, but just know that if you are using a driver who happens to be in prohibited status in the Clearinghouse, that is a 10-pointer. That is going to really jack up your drug and alcohol basic in the CSA system nowadays. So the Clearinghouse is now filtering into the safety measurement system is the point, along with the other things that are discovered during roadside inspections, like possession of drugs, possessions of alcohol, and the DUI type violations. Those are far and away the most common violations that are impacting your drug and alcohol basic. Anything to add, guys, before we move on?
Well, I think with the, when you start adding those clearinghouse type violations in, I think we'll see some of those go down, specifically because before there was no reporting ability for, I shouldn't say reporting, but awareness to the trucking companies that, you had a driver, he went out and tried to get another job, he failed a drug test. It was reported to the clearinghouse, and he just came back to work for you because you didn't know that he had done that. Well, now there's those alerts that go out from the clearinghouse to basically any company on record that this driver has worked for in the last 2 years. I think is what
12
it is.
Months.
Maybe it's 12 months. That hey, this guy showed up in the clearinghouse, so. Hopefully those types of violations will go down because the trucking companies are actually now getting some sort of alert, and that brings in
they're using the clearinghouse.
Yeah, make sure that you have your contact and whoever the contact information is in the clearinghouse is current, because if it's being sent to a wrong email address, you're still not going to know.
Yeah. The other thing that should help, I think, along those similar lines is the change is going to happen in November, which is effective November. I can't remember the day in November, but effective in November of this year, 2024, the states are going to be required to automatically downgrade a CDL driver's CDL to a standard operator's license if they are put into prohibited status in the clearinghouse, which is something that should have happened at the implementation of the clearinghouse, but has been a gap since 2020. Some states do it, other states don't. A lot of states don't currently. They don't automatically downgrade a CDL based on a clearinghouse violation, but effective November 2024, they're going to have to. So that means that if a driver's in prohibited status, they're not going to even have a CDL anymore. So hopefully that cuts down on some of those violations. Anything else, Jared?
I'm all clear. I'll save it
All right.
for the clearinghouse section.
Yeah, you got a lot to talk about there. All right, Brian, I'm going to turn it over to you. Brian's going to talk about drug and alcohol testing more broadly and some of the issues that come up in that regard.
Yeah, so this is the taking away, like Brandon said, from the actual basic scoring and who gets tested and when. And so who is subject to testing? Well, any driver that operates a CMV that requires a CDL. So that takes vehicles and combinations above 26,000 pounds. Drivers that will be transporting more than 16 people, and then anybody hauling hazmat. So that being said, all those drivers need to be enrolled in the clearinghouse and have knowledge of a company's drug testing policy. So that is something that you have to put out in front of your drivers, have them sign, and that's kept on record. The required test types that we see are pre-employment tests. We talked about that a little bit just a couple minutes ago on drivers going for a pre-employment test. And, one of the violations that we see is a driver that has, or not so much a violation, but more so in an audit or a review, is companies using a driver before the test results came back. You have to wait until those pre-employment drug tests come back and the driver's cleared before you can actually put them on the road. So we've seen that happen when we do mock audits and things like that. The random testing, I think the big thing there with random testing, especially if you're a smaller company or an individual, that when you're in a consortium, make sure that consortium is pulling the required amount of drivers that it needs to. It's not company specific in the way that you have bigger companies have to pull a certain amount of drivers every month. Well, the consortium has to do the same thing for whoever's in there, and you want to make sure that they're doing that. The post-accident drug testing, we talked about this on the crash webinar that we did, and it's basically, if there's a fatality, everybody gets tested. On the tow and the injury, where somebody has to be taken away by an ambulance, only if your driver's cited is it required to be tested. So if you're doing testing on those other pieces, we hear companies all the time, if the driver has an accident, we're drug testing them. Well, you would want to do that on a non-DOT form and not a DOT form. Reasonable suspicion. Ask yourself, do you have people that are trained to do reasonable suspicion testing? So that has to be somebody that is trained within your company that has reasonable suspicion that driver is either on drugs or alcohol to send them for a test. The return to duty testing, that is, if someone is tested positive, they go through the SAP program, they have to do the return to duty test to actually get back in the workforce, and then they have to do the follow-up testing, whatever that program looks like. It could be 1, it could be 5 years. I mean, it really, really depends on the severity of the violation that put them in the program to begin with. Common issues that we see, yes, believe it or not, no program in place at all. And that also goes to, typically it's a random type thing. They're not testing for the right amount of drivers. Not testing the correct drivers. If you have a mix of CDL and non-CDL drivers and you're putting a testing program in place, you have to pull the certain amount of 50% from the actual CDL drivers. Those non-CDL drivers do not count. Untimely test, putting a post-accident on a non-DOT form, or I should say on a DOT form when it wasn't supposed to, or not covering the time frame of, okay, your driver was supposed to be tested in the first 8 hours for alcohol and within the first 32 for drugs, and you didn't make that happen. You have to really, really document why that didn't happen, or there's a violation to be had there.
Hey, Brian, here's a question somebody's asking. Jay's asking, regarding reasonable suspicion, if an employee reports to duty, has a CDL, but not in a driving role, when would you do a DOT reasonable suspicion versus a non-DOT in that situation?
Correct me if I'm wrong, Brandon. It would have to be right before they would do a safety-sensitive function, which would be driving. I guess, no, reasonable suspicion could be done at any point, just a matter of whether it was done on a DOT form or not.
So there's a distinction, I think, between drugs and alcohol in this context. So for reasonable suspicion specifically, well, first of all, if this is a driver that's a person who has a CDL that you have enrolled in your drug and alcohol testing program. You do this a lot with mechanics, for example, because they may occasionally need to go out and drive these trucks on the road. And so the regulations say that if there is a reasonable expectation that they may need to operate a CDL-sized vehicle, they need to be in your drug and alcohol testing program, namely your random pool. And so if you have one of those people who shows up for work and one of your trained supervisors has reasonable suspicion to believe that they are under the influence of drugs, for example, then they need to be sent in for a reasonable suspicion test, a DOT reasonable suspicion test, even if they weren't going to be driving that day. The fact that they are enrolled in your DOT drug and alcohol program and that they have a CDL and that there is a reasonable expectation that they may need to drive a CDL-sized vehicle is enough to compel the DOT reasonable suspicion test in that context. For alcohol, it's a little bit different because the alcohol regulations. I'm probably gonna get this wrong off the top of my head, but there's a timing component to it, right? So it's not a violation for CDL drivers to use alcohol, as long as they are not doing so within a certain amount of time before they perform a safety sensitive function. I think it's 4 hours before.
4 hours.
Right?
Yep.
So it gets a little tricky when it comes to reasonable suspicion of alcohol use specifically. Like if that person shows up to your facility and you smell alcohol on their breath, but they weren't scheduled to drive that particular day, it lands you into ambiguity pretty quickly as to whether you can send that driver in for reasonable suspicion testing, because it's not within 4 hours of when he was going to perform a safety sensitive function, assuming he wasn't going to drive that day, for example. So if it's a reasonable suspicion of alcohol use, I think that's where you got to be a little careful. And I would probably lean towards a non-DOT test in that case specifically. But if it's reasonable suspicion, sometimes it's going to be hard to tell what he's under the influence of. Maybe it's not the smell that hints it off, but maybe he's slurring his words. Do we know whether that's drug related or alcohol related? Hard to tell. I think you're safer in that situation to do a reasonable suspicion DOT test. So that's my thoughts.
One other distinction that you kind of touched on, but if you have an employee that has a CDL and they're not performing safety sensitive functions for you, they should not be in your random testing pool, and they're not subject to your drug and alcohol. If they're performing no driving functions, no safety sensitive functions, and they're not expected to, they shouldn't be in your pool. And so in that instance, that CDL holder would not be subject to reasonable suspicion testing in my mind, and they should not be in your pool. So it's perfectly fine to have an employee that has a CDL, no safety sensitive functions. That's not a problem. Just make sure that you're not testing them.
the distinction Jared's drawn from what I said is that just possessing the CDL is not in and of itself what necessitates them being enrolled in your DOT drug and alcohol testing program. It's the likelihood that you're going to expect them to operate a vehicle that requires a CDL. So you may have mechanics, for example, that are sometimes expected, but not very often, to operate out on the roads a CDL size vehicle. They for sure should be included in your drug and alcohol program, even though they may only perform a safety sensitive function once every 3 months or something like that. They should be left in your random pool because there is a reasonable expectation that they may do that. But Jared's right. If you've got somebody who happens to hold a CDL, but you have no expectation that they will need to operate a CDL size vehicle, then they need to be left out of your program. And then you would just do non-DOT test if you're going to do testing at all.
I think I'd add one more person to that too. A lot of companies use somebody internal, whether it's somebody that does their orientation or an operation person to do road tests. So even if that person's going to be sitting second seat in a road test, there could be a possibility that person would have to drive at some point, and that person should be in their random pool.
Yeah. Let's see. Temple is saying it's 8 hours from bottle to throttle. I've never heard that before. But 8 hours, that doesn't seem right. Let me pull up the regulation. I think it's 4 hours.
It's 4. If you go back to the list of most common violations, Brandon, on that screen.
Oh yeah, that's right. It was 4 hours on that screen.
That was there.
I mean, you could still put that on a T-shirt. The phrase.
That's great.
Yeah, I like that phrase. That's kind of goes up there with the nurse, hearse, and tow for remembering when to do the post-accident testing. 4 hours from bottle to throttle. I like that. We got to start using that. Okay. All right, Brian, turning back over to you.
Okay. So I think we were down to, not meeting the minimum random testing percentages. We kind of talked about that already. Having a non-compliant policy, that's, take a look at your policy. Make sure it has all the wording in it that's required for a drug and alcohol testing program. And not utilizing the clearinghouse. And not only that, but having the right release forms for a driver. You can have a release form that states that, one, we do a full query if necessary pre-employment, and if something comes back that requires a full query, or your once a year, you can run those anytime. The annual queries, you can run those at any time if you've got the paperwork documenting that you need to do it at will, or you're wanting to do it at will. So if you're wanting to run Clearinghouse annual, the short, that's not the word, what the
limited queries.
Oh, there we go, the limited. If you're wanting to run the limited queries twice a year, you can do that, as long as you have it stated in the release that the driver signed that you will be doing that.
Yep. With that, we'll turn it over to Jared to talk about Clearinghouse more specifically.
Excellent. So as we've talked about, the Clearinghouse has been around for some time. It was stood up in January of 2020. And so a lot of data has been collected, and we're going to look at some of that data related to violations here in the slides to come. But the overall purpose of the Clearinghouse is to create a repository of violations for CDL drivers that can be queried. And that way, the participants of the Clearinghouse can have real-time data related to the violations for CDL drivers. It also serves the great purpose of replacing that previously manual process of querying previous employers for the last 3 years of drug and alcohol violation data. So that has now gone away since the Clearinghouse has been in effect for more than 3 years. So good news there. The main functions of the Clearinghouse is the ability to query and obtain reports. And so camping out on queries for a moment, Brian touched on limited queries. There's two types, limited queries and full queries. The limited queries are not going to give you detailed information on violations that may exist for a CDL driver. But what they are going to do is reveal that information exists. And what that then does is triggers the obligation of you as the motor carrier to then run a full query, which will give you the substantive details of that violation within 24 hours. So you run your annual limited queries, which is the cadence that you need to run. Every 12 months, every CDL driver has to have a limited query run. And if any one of those CDL drivers comes back with information on the clearinghouse, then again, you as the motor carrier have 24 hours to run the full query. And now that full query is going to reveal whether that driver is in a prohibited status or not prohibited status, which is the rub here. If you fail to act upon a limited query that's run on an annual basis and reveals that information in the clearinghouse exists for a driver, you fail to run the full query then and comprehend that that driver is in prohibited status. The driver continues to run, then you get that high severity 10-point violation that Brandon discussed earlier by allowing a driver to operate in your fleet that is in a prohibited status. And so those annual queries, while it may feel like just going through the motions, definitely should not be that. There should be a process in place for someone to immediately look at those queries and determine which ones have information that needs to trigger that full query. And so while we're on the subject of queries, let's talk about the consent levels. Now, for limited queries, we kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but for the limited queries, you need a general consent signed by the driver. And this is obtained outside of the clearinghouse. And for full queries, you have to have consent obtained through the clearinghouse. And so very different there. So make sure that you have general consents in place for each one of your CDL drivers. This is something that we've seen the DOT check on in the audits that we've had essentially since 2020. They've been checking for these general consent forms, and it's a violation to not have your CDL drivers with general consent forms. That may be one of the forms that we can provide on the on the network. We'll go ahead and post that on the network so you can compare your form to ours or adopt that form if you need to. The participants, obviously CDL drivers, any driver that's subject to drug and alcohol regulations, which are those CDL drivers, are participants in the clearinghouse. Non-CDL drivers, there's going to be no information on these drivers in the clearinghouse. You shouldn't report violations on non-CDL drivers. Additionally, getting outside the scope of participants, but it was touched on non-DOT drug and alcohol testing programs. We see a lot of fleets that are mixed fleets, meaning CDL required vehicles and non-CDL required vehicles. We see a lot of non-CDL holders in those fleets. Just make sure if you have a program for conducting non-DOT testing that you're never reporting non-DOT testing, however that may occur. Of course, employers as motor carriers, medical review officers, substance abuse professionals. Those first three are the biggest players in the clearinghouse. State drivers licensing agencies will query the clearinghouse. Law enforcement will as well. And then we have third-party administrators as well. Digging into some of this data that's been collected since 2020. And Brandon, if you can zoom in on that so I can read that a little better. Yeah, you see here, this top bar, the dark blue, this is the amount of drivers, roughly 254,000 drivers that have had a violation in the clearinghouse. Now, what we want to see is that number in the bright green bar down at the bottom of 80,000. We want to see that number grow exponentially, and it doesn't seem to be growing as quickly as we'd like to see in the industry. And that number represents those CDL holders that have had a violation that are now in not prohibited status, meaning they have completed return to duty testing with negative results and or they've completed the follow-up testing plan that the SAP has prescribed. What we see, contrastingly, is that the number, the light blue number there, roughly 174,000, those drivers represent the pool that are still in a prohibited status after receiving a violation in the clearinghouse. Now, there's a lot of ways you can interpret that, but I think a lot of people would agree that, you know, those drivers that have not started the return to duty process in any certain level, which represents 132,000, those drivers have probably left CDL driving and may not be coming back. So that's bad news there. That's not to say they cannot come back. There could be a lot of reasons for that. They may not be able to find a motor carrier that's going to hire them to complete return to duty testing and administer the program, or maybe they're just confused about what it takes to come back to drive, and they've thrown their hands up. So on the right side there, you'll see the substances that have been identified as the positive drug test. Not surprisingly, marijuana is at the very top of the list there. All right, common issues with the clearinghouse. Brandon alluded to this earlier, but obviously not using the clearinghouse is a violation that we unfortunately see consistently with some of the medium-sized and even small, more commonly small-size carriers. We've done mock audits and supported actual audits and found that motor carriers that have CDL drivers had not registered for the clearinghouse, weren't running queries. You can get a lot of different investigators that will approach this in different ways. Recently, we supported in an audit that was a smaller carrier, but they had not registered for the clearinghouse. The investigator allowed them to register for the clearinghouse, run a lot of queries, and was very lenient. You're not always going to get that. You could find a situation where you could receive a very large civil penalty because the cost per instance of drug and alcohol clearinghouse violations, I believe, is between $8,000 and $9,000. So you could stand to get a very large notice of civil penalty by continuing to not use the clearinghouse if you're required to do so. And guys, stop me if you have anything you want to chime in on, or if there's any questions. Not timely running correct queries. Now, again, we talked about the limited queries. A lot of motor carriers will just pick a month of the year, January, say, and run all of their annual queries. This is a good practice because it allows you as the motor carrier to not be subject to parsing out who needs one in January, then February, March, etc. You just have 1 month of the year and everyone gets their limited query run during that month. It doesn't matter if that driver was, a driver was hired in November. They still get their limited query run in January because that's how you do it as the motor carrier. And again, just because you run those limited queries doesn't mean you're done. You have to make sure that if information pops on those limited queries that you then trigger the full query to be run within 24 hours.
We also see it pretty regularly. You may have mentioned this, Jared, and I may have missed it, but we see this come up quite frequently, particularly with sophisticated carriers that operate through multiple DOT numbers, where sometimes they will try and avoid having to set up so many different clearinghouse accounts that they will try and run all of their queries through one carrier's clearinghouse account, even though they may have drivers that are operating for one of their affiliates. And so what you'll see is the clearinghouse query results that will have a carrier's name that doesn't line up with the carrier that driver has been operating for. That we've seen that cause problems in audits. So just be aware that if you've got multiple DOT numbers, you need to be running them under the DOT number for whom that driver is actually driving. And then another thing we see pretty regularly is carriers running limited queries in situations where they needed to run a full query, namely the pre-employment process. You have to run a full query as a pre-employment query. You can't run a limited one. The benefit you get out of running a limited one is that you avoid having to go get that driver's specific consent in their own clearinghouse account. You don't have to wait for them to log in and remember their credentials and log in and grant your request. You can just run a limited. But that limited is not sufficient in the pre-employment context. That's a violation if you only run a limited in that context. So, Kirk's asking, he says, if you're running annual queries, does the carrier need to obtain annually driver consent forms?
Negative. That general consent form can serve as an ongoing general consent for those drivers to run limited queries. So you only have to do that one time.
And the consent form that we'll put into the system after the webinar today, you'll see that it's structured so that you can run however many limited queries you want for the length of that driver's employment with you or contract with you.
So that's the important part, is make sure the wording the wording on the release that you have specifies that, because if it specifies you can only run one for that first year, then yeah, you'd have to have new forms every year. So make sure your paperwork's right.
All right, Jared, you got a few more here, I think.
Yep. All right. So not reporting. We're going to talk about the reporting obligations a little bit on the next slide, but driver consent, already talked about that. And then not removing drivers from safety sensitive functions. Earlier I mentioned the highway accident risk here, and this bullet point, not removing drivers from safety sensitive functions. I mean, this is a huge aspect of the clearinghouse, and it's an advantage that you get as a motor carrier from the clearinghouse, is that when you find a driver that is in a prohibited status, you have the authority at that point and the obligation to pull them off the road and have them stop performing safety sensitive functions, thus really mitigating your risk at that point. Now, if you fail to act on a driver that is in a prohibited status, then you're inflating your risk at that point. So it's very, very important that processes are set up to remove those drivers when they become prohibited.
Then, Brian, I think you had a point on this last bullet point here that you wanted to raise, which is the difficulty that we've all experienced with challenging clearinghouse issues.
Yeah, just like the top violation there that you saw was using a driver that's in prohibited status in the clearinghouse. Well, to try to data accuse that is very, very difficult in the way that you have to prove that the driver was not in the disqualified in the clearinghouse. So to do that, the first thing you have to do is go get that part of it cleaned up first. Is go to the clearinghouse, say, hey, this driver was put in there incorrectly. And
maybe they should have been tested on a non-DOT test, for example, would be a common example.
Yeah, or who knows? Somehow that it's just the wrong driver or something like that, and then data accuse. Then do the data queue on the violation. That's still no guarantee that it'll get removed because technically the driver was in prohibited status when the violation occurred. But that's really the only way that I can see challenging one of those issues from the clearinghouse that ends up on an inspection report.
All right, Jared, you want to wrap this up with the reporting stuff here?
Yep. Very last thing here, and recognizing that we're short on time, take a screenshot of this if this is new to you, the reporting obligations of prospective and current employers as well as MROs. I will point out the timeframes for reporting. When you become aware of the violation, you have until the close of the third business day, close of business, to report that to the clearinghouse as the employer or the prospective employer. MROs have a different reporting timeline, won't point that out. I want to move to actual knowledge because I wanted to have a couple minutes to talk about this. Actual knowledge, 382.107 really, really details what constitutes actual knowledge, and I'd encourage you, if you're not familiar with that, to go check out 382.107. It actually makes it pretty clear of what actual knowledge actually is, and it points to the distinction and the confusion that's created in the industry between actual knowledge and reasonable suspicion. And so actual knowledge as defined in 382.107 is based on the employer's direct observation of the employee. And direct observation, as used in 382.107, means the observation of alcohol or controlled substances use. Doesn't include
in a way that's
observation
unlawful. Yeah, because that's something we see come up. For example, that alcohol situation I mentioned earlier. Like if you observe your driver drinking alcohol the night before he's driving, for example, that wouldn't be actual knowledge because it has to be actual knowledge of them using drugs or alcohol in a way that would violate the regulations.
Right. And then one step further, the direct observation, but it doesn't include behavioral or physical characteristics sufficient to warrant reasonable suspicion. So what they're saying there is that if you observe a driver that's impaired or slurring speech, etc., that's reasonable suspicion testing and not actual knowledge. if you observe a driver using drugs or, drinking alcohol while operating CMV, obviously that is actual knowledge. So understand that distinction, look at 382.107 and make sure that you have a clear understanding on actual knowledge before you report it as an employer, because there are consequences for doing that.
All right. Well, unless you guys have anything else to add, that kind of wraps up our session for today. Thanks everybody again for joining us. I don't see any other questions, so I'll just remind you, everybody who registered for this webinar, you'll get an email after the fact here with a link to watch the replay. And again, I'd encourage you to join the network so that you can not only watch the replay, but also access the other stuff we're going to throw in there, including that consent form that we talked about, and also the slides from today's presentation. So without further ado, be on the lookout for emails from us about future sessions in this series. Best way to do that is subscribe to our newsletter over at trucksafe.com/subscribe. And in the meantime, if there's anything else we could do for you, don't hesitate to reach out. Thanks everybody for joining us. Appreciate it.